There is a kind of woman who walks alone, not because she was abandoned, not because she is broken, but because she discovered something in solitude that the world could never offer her. She is not bitter, not cold, and not lost. She is simply whole. And wholeness, in a society addicted to noise and validation, is often mistaken for isolation. But if you look closer, you'll see that her silence holds power, her solitude holds truth, and her presence holds a depth carved only by the absence of superficial belonging. The woman who thrives without friends embodies what can be described as the archetype of the solitary seeker. In her solitude, she does not suffer alienation as many might assume. Rather, she engages in a deep, internal dialogue that calls forth the authentic self buried beneath years of societal conditioning. This is not the loneliness of isolation, but the solitude of inner richness. It is within this silent chamber of her own psyche that she begins to awaken to the true structure of her inner world. Unlike those who look outward to define themselves through networks and social affirmation, she turns her gaze inward. In doing so, she calls upon the deeper layers of the psyche, the anima, the shadow, and ultimately the self. The woman alone is not the woman abandoned, but the woman summoned. She is summoned by a deeper instinct, an urge to discover who she is when she is not reflecting others. Her power begins with the recognition that most friendships, while comforting, often tether us to the external constructs of who we think we must be. In peer relationships, one easily dons the mask of politeness, compliance, or expectation, the persona crafted to meet the demands of society. But the woman who detaches from this dynamic steps away from the mirror of the collective and allows her raw, unreflected face to emerge. She no longer performs the subtle theater of belonging. In the absence of this performance, she begins to hear her own voice, initially faint, perhaps hesitant, but it strengthens with time. This voice is not shaped by consensus or popularity, but by something more ancient and instinctual. It speaks of meaning, purpose, and inner calling. Her detachment from social spheres is not an act of defiance, but one of fidelity to her inner life. In myth, the archetype of the solitary woman often appears as the forest-dwelling seer, the mountain priestess, or the silent scribe. She is misunderstood by society precisely because her wisdom does not emerge from conformity. Her consciousness is not fragmented by the chatter of many voices, but is unified through silent integration. She walks away from the village not to escape, but to remember. The outer world provides many roles to play: friend, confidant, companion, but it seldom encourages the one role that is the most difficult to assume, the role of the self-aware soul. For this, silence is needed, and from silence comes self-confrontation. She walks through the valley of her own doubts and dreams, not to impress anyone, but to discern truth from illusion. Her power arises when she discovers that her completeness was never dependent on another's gaze. There is a spiritual intensity to her path. She often experiences inner visions, not in the supernatural sense, but as deep intuitive insights that emerge when the soul is unclouded by the need to belong. Her mind becomes a sanctuary, her solitude a forge. She is no longer lured by the temporary warmth of superficial connection, because she has kindled a fire within. Her time alone becomes an alchemical process. She reads, she reflects, she questions, and through this process, her consciousness evolves. Her conversations are no longer external but internal, held with the most ancient parts of herself. Her ancestors speak to her in dreams, her future self whispers guidance. This woman is not empty. She is full to the brim with presence. What the world sees as detachment is actually devotion. She is devoted to truth, not trend, to integrity, not influence, to authenticity, not approval. In this devotion she becomes unshakable. She is not hardened, but centered. She does not resist connection, but she does not require it for validation. Her presence in the world becomes a quiet revolution. She may not be loud, but she is immovable. She may not be surrounded, but she is supported by a greater force, her own self, fully realized, fully present, and fully sovereign. To transcend the persona is to relinquish the false mask one wears to belong, to please, to be accepted. The woman who thrives without friends steps into this task with an unconscious courage that many are never forced to develop. In her distance from the collective, she is confronted with the realization that much of who she was in social environments was a construct, crafted to suit the needs of the group, the expectations of culture, the role she was assigned. The persona is not inherently negative. It is necessary in social life. It allows for communication, function, and order. But the danger of the persona is in its ability to replace the self. When one becomes the role entirely, when the mask is mistaken for the face, authenticity is lost, and the soul begins to decay under the weight of performance. The woman without friendships must reckon with this reality in a way most others are never challenged to. There is no one left to impress, no echo chamber of mutual illusion, no obligation to be agreeable in order to maintain closeness. In the absence of others, she is faced only with herself, raw, unfiltered, unsanitized. And it is in this confrontation that she begins the sacred process of shedding the mask. She is no longer the caregiver for others' insecurities, nor the agreeable voice in the room that seeks harmony at the cost of truth. She is, instead, confronted with the weight of her own truths, her fears, her instincts, her passions, and she learns to own them without apology. The dissolution of the persona does not happen all at once. It is a disorienting experience. She may feel grief for the identity she spent so long curating. There may be moments when she longs to return to the comfort of fitting in, of belonging, of being needed. But those moments are fleeting and are gradually replaced with an emerging clarity. The face she begins to see in the mirror is not the social self, but the soul beneath it. In stillness, she begins to recognize which parts of her were adopted for survival, which beliefs were inherited rather than earned, and which emotional responses were performative rather than genuine. She no longer seeks agreement from others to validate her experience. She becomes her own authority. With each layer of the persona that is stripped away, she feels more exposed and yet more whole. The opinions of others begin to lose their grip, not because she becomes arrogant, but because she becomes anchored. Her value is no longer contingent on her likability, her social availability, or her role within a group dynamic. Instead, it arises from the integrity of her inner life. She becomes immune to superficial praise because she sees through its contingency. She becomes indifferent to exclusion because she no longer participates in the game of roles. She is not indifferent to others' humanity, but she refuses to compromise her truth for the sake of fitting in. Her solitude becomes the crucible through which she is purified of inauthenticity. In silence, she discovers her real voice, one that was long buried beneath obligation, approval-seeking, and fear. The woman who thrives without friends often has sharper vision, not because she sees more, but because there is less noise distorting her perception. She begins to distinguish her genuine desires from conditioned ones. Her dreams are no longer those inherited from culture or peer expectation. They are intimate, personal, and resonant. When the persona is shed, she may find that even her past ambitions were not truly hers, but adaptations to a system that rewarded conformity. Transcending the persona is not about rebellion, it is about revelation. The woman alone reveals herself to herself, and in this revelation she no longer needs an audience. She becomes the observer and the observed. Her solitude is not an empty space. It is a mirror that shows her not who she is supposed to be, but who she actually is. There she finds something that cannot be faked, a self that is whole, without applause, without echo, without reflection, a self that finally is real. The woman who thrives without friends inevitably embarks on the most intimate confrontation a human can experience, the meeting with her own shadow. In solitude, there is no longer a convenient diversion, no outward relational dynamic to project discomfort upon. She cannot escape into chatter, into approval, into performance. All the contents of her unconscious begin to rise in the silence, some beautiful, some terrifying. This is the nature of the shadow. It contains not only the repressed wounds and fears, but also the disowned powers, the primal instincts, and the truths we have been conditioned to suppress in favor of societal expectations. The woman alone becomes the stage upon which these elements rise. Unlike those surrounded by constant validation or distraction, she is stripped of illusion, and so the shadow demands to be seen. In the absence of close friendships, she cannot easily blame others for her discomfort, nor can she displace inner tension onto surface-level drama. There is no one to mirror her projections, no one to absorb her displaced fear or envy. Instead, she begins to notice thoughts that feel unfamiliar, yet strangely intimate. She may feel impulses she once judged in others. She may recognize emotions she was taught to label as unworthy. Rage, jealousy, arrogance, these forces surface not to punish her, but to initiate her. The woman who integrates her shadow becomes whole. She stops dividing herself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. She ceases the exhausting task of editing her existence for social comfort. In doing so, she discovers something radical. The parts she feared most hold the very power she needs to become her full self. Her jealousy, once disavowed, reveals a hunger for recognition. Her rage becomes clarity about boundaries long ignored. Her fear speaks of neglected wounds that require healing, not suppression. Her arrogance might not be arrogance at all, but a glimpse of her forgotten worth. The shadow is not a moral failing, it is unintegrated life force. Without others to serve as scapegoats or mirrors, this woman must become responsible for the entirety of her psyche. She learns the art of sitting with discomfort without reaching for external soothing. She becomes intimate with her chaos, and in that intimacy she finds peace. Not the peace of ignorance, but the peace that comes from knowing the landscape of the self. This process is never clean. The integration of the shadow is messy, emotional, often frightening. She may resist, retreat, fall into despair, but these moments are part of the alchemical fire. They are necessary to burn away illusion. In walking this internal terrain, she discovers the profound difference between image and essence. She no longer needs to appear good because she has become whole. Wholeness includes the light and the dark, the sacred and the profane, the sinner and the sage. Her power emerges not from perfection, but from integration. Others may still be performing roles to remain lovable. She has gone deeper. She no longer demands perfection of herself, nor does she judge others from a place of disconnection. Because she has met her own shadow, she holds space for the complexity in others, but she is no longer manipulated by it. The unconscious no longer governs her in secret, it now serves her with clarity. She is no longer afraid of her own depths, and therefore she cannot be easily controlled. A woman who has befriended her shadow cannot be blackmailed by the parts of herself that once haunted her. That is where her unshakable power begins. When a woman lives without the influence of friends, something extraordinary happens to her intuitive faculties. In a world saturated with opinions, trends, judgments, and projections, intuition is often muffled by the louder voice of the collective, but when she no longer swims in the sea of social validation, her inner compass begins to awaken. Without constant external input, she learns to distinguish the subtle whisper of her inner knowing from the echoes of groupthink. Her decisions are no longer informed by what others would advise, expect, or model. Instead, she develops a unique intimacy with her instinctual knowledge, an unconscious wisdom that rises from the depths when the surface becomes still. Most people, in their desire to belong, begin to tune their inner frequencies to those around them. They adopt beliefs, mimic behaviors, or question their insights if they differ too sharply from the group. But the woman who thrives alone is released from this dance. Her solitude becomes a training ground for the refinement of intuition. With fewer social distractions, she can feel the shift in her body when a truth is spoken, or when something feels off. She begins to notice how her energy contracts or expands in different situations, how dreams carry meaning not yet understood by the conscious mind, how synchronicities become more frequent and vivid. What others might dismiss as coincidence, she recognizes as symbolic pattern. She becomes fluent in the language of the psyche. This woman, no longer diluted by the opinions of others, becomes a sharp listener, not to the noise outside, but to the signals within. She trusts hunches that others might ignore. She follows the internal yes or no that arises without explanation. This guidance system does not come from the rational mind alone. It transcends logic while still respecting it. She does not act impulsively, but she also does not suppress her knowing for the sake of appearing reasonable. With no one around to second-guess her every thought, she learns to experiment with her own truth. She takes action and watches the feedback from life itself. Reality becomes her mirror. She no longer depends on the nod of approval from friends to confirm the validity of her perceptions. She consults her dreams, her body, her silence. This intuitive strength becomes a kind of internal sanctuary. It is not loud or boastful. It is steady and unyielding. She may appear quiet to others, but she is watching, feeling, sensing layers beneath the surface. Her choices may not make sense to the outside world. She may leave relationships others would stay in, or walk away from opportunities others would chase. But this is not rebellion. It is resonance. She no longer asks, "What should I do?" but instead listens for, "What is aligned for me?" That difference, subtle as it seems, changes the course of a life. Intuition, unclouded by noise, becomes a superpower. It allows her to navigate uncertainty with grace, to perceive hidden motives in others without confrontation, to avoid danger without panic, to embrace opportunities that have not yet revealed their logic. The woman who thrives without friends often lives at a different rhythm. She may move more slowly, more deliberately, but also more precisely, because she is not scattered by 100 voices pulling her in 100 directions. She is more deeply rooted in her own rhythm. Her solitude has taught her the cost of distraction, the seduction of conformity, and the power of stillness. She lives in closer relationship with the unconscious, the symbolic, the spiritual, not because she sought mysticism, but because intuition flourishes where social static dissolves. Her discernment becomes sharper. She does not need to explain her choices to be at peace with them. Her alignment speaks louder than her words. She walks with a quiet clarity that others feel but cannot always understand. And that, too, is her power. The woman who thrives without friends enters a profound psychological state where her worth is no longer negotiated externally. She learns to withdraw the projection of value she once placed in the eyes of others and begins the arduous but liberating task of reclaiming it for herself. In ordinary social life, self-worth is constantly being affirmed, adjusted, or denied through the mirrors of friendship and community. A kind word, a compliment, a shared experience. These affirmations become subtle currencies of self-esteem. But when those relationships fall away or are never present to begin with, the inner scaffolding that holds one's sense of worth is revealed for what it is: fragile, unfinished, or even non-existent. This moment is often terrifying because it unmasks the reality that so much of who one thought they were was built on others' reflections. But it is in this emptiness that something more durable can be built. The woman in solitude, forced to live without a network of validation, discovers the radical act of affirming herself, not through arrogance or inflated self-regard, but through an authentic inward recognition of value that does not need to be proven or observed. She begins to notice the way she speaks to herself when no one is listening. She becomes attuned to her internal narratives, how she assigns blame, how she diminishes herself, how she hesitates to own her strengths. In solitude, these patterns become unignorable. And so begins the reprogramming of self-worth from the inside out. She stops asking questions like, "Am I good enough for them?" and instead asks, "Am I living in integrity with myself?" This subtle shift transforms everything. Her value is no longer a currency traded for affection, loyalty, or social inclusion. It becomes a sacred recognition, something felt in the bones, not up for debate. This intrinsic worth reshapes her posture in the world. She no longer overextends to earn closeness, nor does she dim her light to avoid rejection. She walks into rooms not wondering whether people will like her, but whether she will feel authentic in that space. She trusts that her presence, her truth, her essence is enough, not because someone said so, but because she has made peace with herself. This internal stability is not given, it is built. Day by day she replaces self-judgment with inquiry, self-abandonment with compassion. She recognizes that being without friends has allowed her to hear herself clearly for the first time. In the silence, she hears the longing of the child within her, who once begged for attention, for validation, for someone to say she mattered. Now, she answers that child with gentleness instead of criticism. She becomes her own witness, her own mirror, her own advocate. And in doing so, she discovers a kind of strength that cannot be taken away. When value is located externally, it can be lost as soon as someone withdraws love or attention. But when value is internalized, it becomes untouchable. She is no longer swayed by rejection, nor is she inflated by praise. She sees both as passing reflections, not sources of truth. Her sense of self becomes sovereign, self-sustaining. She is less likely to tolerate abuse, manipulation, or relationships that require her to shrink. Not because she is bitter, but because she knows her worth. This grounded self-worth begins to shape every choice she makes, from the way she spends her time to the way she speaks to strangers, to the people she allows into her life. Everything is filtered through the lens of self-respect, not self-importance, but self-respect, and that makes her unshakable. She is no longer playing a social game, she is living a psychological truth, the truth that real power begins when a woman no longer waits for the world to tell her she matters. She already knows. A woman who thrives without friends undergoes a transformation in which solitude becomes her forge, and her identity is no longer fragmented by social roles. In the typical course of life, much of what we call personality is not a unified self, but a collection of masks, pieces of identity carefully constructed to fit varying expectations: the agreeable friend, the supportive confidant, the funny one, the listener, the peacemaker. These masks are often adopted unconsciously, shaped over time by interactions, subtle judgments, and the deep human desire to belong. But when a woman no longer participates in these constant relational dynamics, when there are no friendships requiring her to mold herself to preserve harmony or gain acceptance, those masks begin to fall away. In their absence, something startling emerges: the raw self, undefined and unfiltered. This is both liberating and disorienting. She may initially experience an identity crisis. Who is she, really, without the mirrors of others reflecting back approval or disapproval? What does she actually believe when she's not echoing the opinions of a group? What does she enjoy when she's not performing enjoyment for someone else's comfort? These questions do not arise in a life full of social distraction. They emerge only when silence stretches long enough to touch the deeper layers of the psyche. And through this confrontation, the process of individuation begins. Invitation is not about becoming perfect or morally superior. It is about becoming whole. It means integrating the various fragments of identity into a cohesive self that is no longer torn between outer roles and inner truths. The woman who thrives without friends begins to explore parts of herself that were once buried beneath the pressure to belong. She may discover hidden creative urges, unspoken values, or long-neglected desires. She may confront contradictions within herself and learn to hold them without shame. She stops trying to be consistent for others and instead strives to be congruent with herself. This deep psychological refinement makes her identity not just stronger, but more authentic. She stops being a reaction to her environment and becomes a source in her own right. Her thoughts are truly her own, not borrowed from those she wishes to impress. Her behavior stems from inner alignment, not social conditioning. She begins to act not out of compulsion or fear of rejection, but from a clear sense of who she is and what she stands for. This clarity gives her a kind of magnetic gravity. People may not always understand her, but they feel the solidity in her presence. She no longer splinters herself to maintain peace in relationships. She no longer withholds her truth to avoid conflict. She no longer changes shape to fit into the frameworks others offer her. And because of this, when she does choose to engage with others, she does so from a place of grounded self-awareness. She is not needy, nor is she guarded. She is sovereign. Connection becomes a choice, not a necessity. Relationships, when they happen, are based on mutual truth rather than mutual dependency. And so, in her solitude, the woman becomes whole, not incomplete, not lonely, but full unto herself. She has faced the silence and found a voice within it. She has stepped outside the web of social expectation and found the shape of her own soul. This woman, unfragmented and unmasked, holds a power that few can comprehend, because she has walked the lonely road inward and returned not with roles to play, but with a self to live. The woman who thrives without friends is not defined by absence, but by presence, her own. She is not shaped by the roles others expect her to play, but has sculpted herself from the raw material of inner truth. Her strength is not in resistance, but in clarity, not in rebellion, but in alignment. She has faced the silence of being unseen, only to become someone who no longer needs to be seen to feel real. She has cultivated intuition, self-worth, emotional independence. and a fiercely authentic identity, not despite her solitude, but because of it. She is proof that there is a power far deeper than popularity, a beauty more enduring than charm, and a freedom more sacred than fitting in. She walks a path few understand, but those who do feel its resonance. Because she does not follow the world, she follows her soul, and that is the rarest strength of all.